move forward with Mr. Vansteekinste. And I see some light coming in from your window in Brussels, which is a good thing, taking into notice that it's the end of, we're still in the last days of winter. I didn't see that coming, but it's very hopeful. So if you could tell us a bit more for our Greek audience here about the role and the scope of European issuers and the problems that you're dealing with at the pan-European level.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to address the difficulties we see from our side or how we try to cope them. First of all, I was listening to what Camille was saying from Euronext that we know very well, because I was myself CEO of a Belgian mid-cap company for 20 years, to 1919 until 2010. And in that period, we were happy to be on the stock market because it allowed us to find the necessary funds to make our company grow. And in some moments of crises, like everybody has sometimes in the life of a company, to find the money that was needed to our continuity. So in this respect, when we look at the situation then, I think there is quite a difference with what it is today, because at that moment, many companies were seeing stock market as being the real solution for their funding. And the regulation was basically not simple, as Camille explained, but it was feasible. Until 2009 arrived, the crisis, the financial crisis, where you suddenly had a lot of new regulations to protect the investors or to protect the banks of making no mistakes. So when I left in 2020, I said, oh, the things are changing, and I became president of European Issues in 2014 and found that the complexity of 2009 was even increased quite dramatically. So at that moment, the CMU, the European Commission, decided to launch a project called CMU, Capital Markets Union, that I followed very closely, being in working groups at the European Commission. And we had a very good cooperative working group with many people around the table. I always will remember that. And we found good and bad solutions. For example, one of the good solutions, but that did not work very well, was the pre-market approach, in which we said we will create a market where people are not obliged to follow the regulations, but they are so-called to be on a stock market. And that didn't work very well because the investors were not so interested to follow those markets, because they were not sure that there was enough certainty for what they proposed to their clients. There were other things. For example, I proposed and the group that I was working in fully agreed with it, a transition element for smaller companies coming to the stock exchange, in the sense that I proposed a system of transition of a couple of years with a comply or explain system. If you comply with the rules, okay. If you cannot comply with the rules, you explain why you cannot comply, and you tell in your reporting when you will achieve that. And of course, there must be a limit in years. So we approved that, and strangely enough, that never came into a law, because somewhere there was opposition from, I presume, the European Parliament. And then I tell you that because I want to stress the difficulty today that we are living in relation to the burden of regulation for companies that try to go to the stock markets. First of all, today, we are in a very difficult situation. We are 5 years later now, after that CMU project finished. We are confronted with an increasing competitive environment in European economy versus the rest of the world. May it be China or other places, that's not important. We are on top of confronted with a difficulty called Ukraine and the war over there. And we are also taking responsibility, which I think is good in relation to the climate change, but that brings a lot of complications and obligations for companies. So companies will need in the next years to come much more money to assure the growth of their company like we did in the past, but also to assure their continuity of existence, because in relation to the whole issues around the climate change, some companies even have to review almost totally their strategy, their products, the recyclability, the way they are producing it, the relations with their suppliers and customers, their own CO2 production, etc., etc. So to handle that, you will need very innovative projects, and smaller companies will be confronted as much as bigger ones. Bigger ones will have more capability to answer that, but the smaller companies that we want to attract to the listed markets will have a lot of difficulties to address the issue and will need a lot of money. And in that respect, we have to realize that in Europe, only 1/3 of the financing of the economy is done through listed to stock exchanges, and 2/3 is done through banks. In the United States, it's just the opposite. In the United States, the investment, the stock exchanges have more investors that are willing to take risks, which is something that is embedded in innovative and difficult projects. Banks, by the way, are not built to do those kind of approaches. So they are not meant to take risks, so it has to come from the stock markets. But then our companies, our smaller companies that try to enter in that market, look at the burden of regulation and are very afraid to do so, which ended in basically a high reduction of IPOs over the last 10 years and a reduction in total of companies that are quoted on the European stock markets, which is for me a main concern. And in that respect, I want to do an appeal to all, and certainly to you as a community, but I would do it to other countries in Europe the same way. We have to act together to find answers to that, so that we can bring the companies, the investors to the stock market, being interested to do so, maybe with fiscal advantages or with other means. And we have to bring companies to the regulated market so that they have access to the capital they need. And to do this, we are all responsible. I think what I see, I am myself also in the board of EFRAC, making the standards for sustainability. And I see there the whole community is there, NGOs, unions, civil society, auditors, banks, investors. Myself as a representative for the listed companies, I'm the only one that represent companies, and there is somebody from Business Europe. We are confronted with a huge demand of rules and reporting that is totally unfeasible, which ended with a first set of rules in 2022 that was so dramatically high because we were not able to defend ourselves against the demands of academics in the room, auditors, etc., etc., and unions and NGOs, that it ended up, happily enough, with the full realization by the European Commission that that was not something they could impose on companies. So we are now working on the simplification set, but it's a very long process. So my appeal is to the Greek community: how can you, or are you thinking about how to organize yourself the best way you can to make this process happening much faster? And I think people like Euronext, of course, can play a very big role in this because they are used to find systems that are working in many countries. So I applaud for whoever that creates a capital market that is more homogeneous, but I am not pleading for or against other capital players in the market. That's not my role. But we have to find a process that speed up. And in this, that means that governments have to take responsibility together with the authorities that are controlling the markets, together with other people. For example, the associations of the enterprises have to play a role, the sector associations and the other ones, to make it such that a group of people that is more reasonable, because I see as a positive sign that the European Commission has realized that they have to become more reasonable. For example, the transition today is a subject that is accepted, while it was not accepted before because they were afraid that company would misuse that facility for bad reporting or non-reporting. Today they realize that transition is a notion that is absolutely needed. But we have to act quickly. We cannot wait too long. So that's my appeal. How can we, for example, in the Greek community, or my colleagues in the panel have an answer? How can we better organize such that Greece has one voice, Italy has a voice, and then that process is not anymore, how much that fragmented through back and forth discussions from people who are standing up and saying, I am totally in favor of a harmonized system, but you have to respect my priority. And you end up with something on a European level that is certainly not acceptable.
Okay.
That was my message in the first sense.
If I'm understand correctly, Mr. Vansteekinste, you're agreeing with what you've heard in the past few minutes. What are your policy proposals?
I agree in principle about what Camille is saying, but for example, on the sustainability reporting, in the beginning, it was for all companies that have a certain size, about above 450 million euro sales and about above, I think, 750 people or 500 people in the beginning even. We had to find a solution for that. So at the end of the day, we could convince the European Commission that they would start only with the listed ones. And in the beginning, we had an agreement that would be much higher than 450 million and turnover and more than 1,500 to 2,000 people. But suddenly, again, and that was the disappointment, it started to become reduced. It was not more than 1,000 people and more than 450 million. So this is, of course, not an ideal solution, but because it is not applicable to other companies that are not listed and that have a certain size, but it was a tentative to reduce the burden and to limit it to companies that were capable of handling it. And also in that respect, you should be aware that when I look to my member companies, some companies claim that they want to do every demand from the European Commission. So they go for, we can handle it, we do it, and we will be the best in competition when the burden of reporting is big. While we say, hey, you should find solutions that are for everybody applicable. And that is, of course, always a compromise. So in that sense, for what is now on the table, we have said that we still want to have more simplification as quoted companies, but we have accepted the notion that in the the first years, it will only be for listed ones, and only thereafter it would become for non-listed ones, so that we have a kind of a step approach to introduce the system. And for the other companies, it would be on a voluntary basis and not on a mandatory basis. So they will be anyway involved in the system through the fact that in the value chain, everybody is obliged to check if all the rules of the ESG are respected. So anyway, the companies that are not listed will slowly but surely enter into the system. So that's the only clarification I wanted to give and why it has been, at the end of the day, specified like that.
Okay, thank you very much for this.